Welcome back, 365 Sports. Connor O'Gara from Saturday Down South. It's been a couple weeks since we had the holiday and all that in between. But, Connor, a lot's happened. And I'm curious, before we get into the SEC Championship this week, your thoughts on some of the coaching changes around the country, particularly at UCF, where you're very familiar with Gus Malzahn from his time in the SEC. He left to go be the offensive coordinator at Florida State, which I guess we'll see how that works out. Like, it's one of those things that it sounds like a good idea. It could be like the best idea or the worst idea that Mike Norvell's had. But what are your thoughts on Gus Malzahn at this point in his career, bailing on being a head coach and a job at UCF that has a lot of potential if the right person gets there?
Yeah, and look, I've lived in Orlando now for 9+ years, and I've seen so many different iterations of UCF football, and from the winless season to getting to a place where it's claiming a national championship, and the fact that we've seen so many different sides of UCF would suggest that this is a bit more volatile, and I would disagree. I think it's a tremendous job, especially now that they're in the Big 12, of course, being in the state of Florida. I thought Gus should have taken a gap year and kind of reevaluated instead of, being at this place where he really, in my opinion, didn't have time to reset after, things ended the way that they did at Auburn. And so, they did a huge marketing pitch to try and get him that momentum. And it was a retread, but they tried to make you feel like it wasn't. They branded him as the future of college football. They put the billboards up in Gainesville saying that, like, blah, blah, blah miles to the future of college football. And it didn't work. It just didn't. And it's kind of a reminder with the Mack Brown thing as well. Retreads are only going to take you so long. And I do think that this job covets a really solid candidate, an up-and-coming candidate would make more sense to me. I'm surprised that the Lincoln Riley thing even saw the light of day, that they're apparently contacting him according to multiple reports. But yeah, it's a tremendous job now that it's in the Big 12. And I think that they can kind of swing for one of those heavy hitters in terms of the up and coming candidates.
Yeah, it's to me, I'm looking at a Jamie Chadwell, a John Sumrall, someone like that that's just been maybe blocked a little bit or like locked into this. That's who I'd want at UCF.
Yeah, I suggest Ryan Silverfield would be my primary target. I think Ryan Silverfield at Memphis has done a whale of a job. And I don't mean to discredit Memphis, a team that I predicted was going to make the college football playoff this year, and ultimately went 10-2 and had a really, really solid season. Of course, kind of capped off by the win against Tulane last week on Thanksgiving. But I think that you have to consider those dynamics if you're at the Group of 5 level. And Memphis didn't get that call in the same way that others in the AAC did. And Ryan Silverfield has built a heck of a program. And the job that they have been able to do over there, kind of being a consistent winner and establishing that floor, I think that's what UCF should be looking for. And I do think that it's a little bit more destination than stepping stone than it was 3-4 years ago. And that's the good news for UCF, is that it could potentially hire someone like this and think, okay, we could have someone like that for a decade. And that wasn't the case when Scott Frost was there. And obviously his alma mater came calling. But I do think that someone like Ryan Silverfield would make a ton of sense. I would love Charlie Weiss Jr. there. I think he's someone that's really respected in coaching circles, was the youngest coordinator at the FBS level when Lane hired him to be his OC at FAU. And of course, then he ends up following him to Ole Miss. But I think that this job would covet a really solid up-and-coming coach in the sport. I think Alex Golesh would be tremendous. I know UCF fans pushed back on me for that one because they didn't like him really when he was there. But I think Alex Golesh is tremendous, and he's doing a really nice job at USF, and that would make a lot of sense for him as well. But yeah, it's going to covet some pretty high markets candidates, especially when you consider the lack of vacancies right now in the coaching carousel.
What do you think about Gus going back to being a coordinator?
Not crazy about it. Not crazy about it. And, I'll say this. I'll credit Gus for taking that step and realizing he might be better suited to just focus on calling plays and do that. Like, we've seen plenty of examples of coaches that are doing that, and it's kind of worked out well. I think Al Golden at Notre Dame as a DC this year, he's a Broyles Award semifinalist. The job that he has done, I think that kind of speaks to a guy who just didn't work out as a head coach, kind of meant to be a coordinator, and it's working out really, really well for him. I think you could go up to Penn State, and Tom Allen, was coaching at my alma mater, Indiana, and now the job that he's doing with that Penn State defense, taking over Manny Diaz's unit. I think that's another example of a guy where you're just like, yeah, maybe you're better suited to be a coordinator, but I don't know that Gus has the chops as a play caller. I really don't. I wonder if he's a decade removed from his peak and if the sport has kind of caught up to him. And ironically enough, maybe it feels a little bit like what Gus tried to do going into 2020, where, this was a guy who hires Chad Morris to be his OC. And you're going, Gus, what are you doing? And I remember talking to Gene Chizik about that, and somebody that I've become friendly with over the years. And Gene was like, yeah, man, I don't know if that's going to be the move. I don't know if that's going to be the move to kind of, get them on the right offensive track. And then we know how that plays out. But yeah, it's not necessarily the move that I would have hoped for if I was a Florida State fan. But hey, crazier things have happened. And clearly they're starting from scratch and realizing they need to be able to win and put some points on the board this next year.
I would say that I am a Florida State fan, but I would say the positive of it to me is this has not been a team that has really run the ball really well outside of having superstar running backs that get through it. And Gus is really good at that part of it. It's the rest of it that worries me. And maybe that's where Mike Norvell and he can mesh together and make that better.
Here's the issue. When was the last time Gus developed a quarterback?
It's been a while.
It's been a long time, like real long. I'm talking Jarrett Stidham. Is that what we're going to give him credit for? Because that guy came in as a very decorated transfer recruit who would have stayed at Baylor if not for all of that. And I think you could make the case. I don't know that Gus gets credit for developing Jarrett Stidham. That was kind of a square peg round hole.
He was pretty developed when he left. I mean,
I know you guys know Jared in your neck of the woods, and that so like you kind of go back and you're like, all right, well, you're not going to give him credit for the Bo Nix development because he transferred from Auburn. It obviously was limited with Gus, and we only had the 2 years of the Bo Gus relationship, but I don't know, that's more so the issue. And I was as big of a KJ Jefferson advocate as there was.
Me too. I was with you. Yeah.
He was my QB1 going into last season in the SEC. And to see the way that played out this year was troubling. Now, you're right. Great running attacks. That's kind of a set it and forget it thing. I mean, I don't think RJ Harvey needed the Gus Malzahn offense to take off. He's a great player. But at the same time, yes, if you're looking to establish that element, you should feel good about that. I would just kind of question the certainty that maybe some FSU fans would have that, all of a sudden this offense is going to take off and we're going to feel much better about our quarterback situation.
No, I do think that that they hit on something with the group of players that they had. And if you really watch 2023, it was a lot of Jordan Travis and Trey Benson and guys like that just being superior athletes. It wasn't anything that was scheme or like nothing was brilliant. It was just like, oh, these guys can play. Like that was it.
I would love to know, and this would have to be a really deep dive off-season exercise, but the Jordan Travis WAR stat among guys in the playoff era, that's wins above replacement, not really a college football metric in the same way that it is with baseball, of guys who were just so much better than their successors. He's got to be up there of like top 5, top 10 in the college football playoff committee. I mean, they told us that they said, look, we're seeing this in a small sample size and we can make that determination. And I think every FSU fan and their mother can see, oh gosh, after Jordan Travis, man, it was really, really tough sledding this entire season. But man, if you actually did that breakdown of like guys that were just impossible to replace right now, Jordan Travis is looking like one of the front runners in that discussion.
They shouldn't just build a statue of him. They should just build statues of him all around the stadium, like different versions of things that he did. That's how good he was and what he brought the program back from, almost single-handedly, really. Now, Mack Brown retired, or not retired. He was fired. But, I mean, that was kind of – I think that was more contractual, like – they were kind of hoping he would retire, and then he was like, well, look, I've been doing this a long time. If I don't retire, I can build another lake house. So you guys make your decision whatever you want. But he probably knew he wasn't going to be there.
It's too bad.
Yeah.
It's too bad the way that it played out, because I think Mac has such great respect within the sport, within the industry, and not just because he won a national championship 2 decades ago. I think that there's just great respect for who he is, how transparent he is. And sometimes it just doesn't work out. Sometimes you get to a place and you realize this is I'm not necessarily finding the right answers on the offensive side of the ball. I can't necessarily make that defensive coordinator hire work. And it's from a personal level for me, like knowing Gene Chizik, and then I actually got to know Jeff Collins a bit as well. So I feel like I've been rooting for the UNC defense for the last 3 seasons, and it just has not worked out well. And you kind of see some of the issues that they've dealt with. Was it like the Tez Walker thing last year, the way that played out? But it's just been more frustration, despite the fact that you've had 2 elite quarterback prospects, and it for whatever reason hasn't translated to the success that UNC fans had hoped for coming off of the 2020 season. So yeah, it's unfortunate that one of the most respected names in this sport is had to go out that way. But it is a really intriguing vacancy, and I'll be interested to see if they can covet one of these power conference coaches, if they're going to pursue someone kind of off the radar. There's a name like Matt Campbell gets thrown out there, and that could be an interesting one to kind of keep in mind for that job. Jamie Chadwell, I know that people are talking about him as well, of what is that UNC job with those resources in this era of the sport? What does that covet, even in a place where it's a basketball school going in?
Yeah, it is. Well, this is why I would kind of covet the job, though, because you can kind of hide for 3 months where everybody else can't. Like, you can go through signing day and all that stuff, and the basketball team's playing. You can kind of operate in the shadows.
It's tough.
Yeah,
it's tough. I went to Indiana, and so I know this dynamic really, really well of what that's like to be at a place where that if you are not in contention in mid-October, if you don't get off to one of these 5-1, 4-2 starts with a win against a team that you're not supposed to beat, those fans lose interest in a hurry. And very quickly, the calendar turns and it's basketball season, and football is on the back burner, and you're not the big man on campus anymore. And that's a little bit of a tough thing, I think, for, not just from an ego standpoint, but, just to know and to be able to recruit and have kids on campus and know that they're not going to be the most popular kids on campus. I do think that that's something that, with 18 to 22-year-old kids, that sounds like a cliche thing, but I do think that matters. And I've heard stories of that at places like Kentucky, where something like that comes up, and kids get on campus at Kentucky and they go, wait, this is a basketball school though, right? Like, why would I play football at Kentucky? That just sounds a little weird. And Mark Stoops done a great job changing that perception. But, it's something that those basketball schools tend to fight in Kansas, and Lance Leipold, they fight that as well. And it's just not an easy thing to do. It's why Kurt Cignetti gets all the credit in the world for the job that he's done at Indiana as arguably the best coach in college football this season. So, yeah, I mean, you're right. You can kind of hide in the shadows, but there are different hurdles that you kind of have to overcome. And, when it comes to fundraising, doing all those other things, it's tough to feel like you're second fiddle.
All right, one more coach question. West Virginia, they're open. Neil Brown, I don't think they really wanted to pay a buyout or anything like that, but I don't think that Neil Brown and the fans' relationship could be repaired there. So they had to make that decision. The 3 jobs we've talked about all have a tremendous amount of potential, and I think the most unrealized is North Carolina. Like, there's no way they should be 40-plus years without an ACC title with the kind of resources they have, but that's where they are in football. But West Virginia is an interesting one in the Big 12 that is going to be constantly up for grabs every single year. And that's a place that really cares, but also kind of a basketball school too. What do you think about West Virginia?
Jimbo Fisher or bust? I mean,
yeah.
Come on. Like, this seems too obvious. It does. And I think that Jimbo Fisher, and being on Sirius with my guys, Jacob Hester and EJ Manuel, and doing those regular segments this year, was his way of saying, I'm still I don't feel like my best days are behind me. I feel like I can still coach at a high level. And I think he's wanted to stay locked into the changing landscape of the sport. And I'm not saying that means Jimbo Fisher or West Virginia will work out, but everybody knows his roots there. And he would be the splashy hire in Morgantown that they would certainly move the needle for. And I mean, from an expense standpoint, they would do a lot of things to get Jimbo Fisher on board if that can work out, and getting Jimbo Fisher away from, replacing Bobby Bowden and stepping into this situation at A&M, where obviously it's kind of SEC championship or bust expectations on a yearly basis with those resources. maybe it'd be good for Jimbo Fisher. I mean, we just talked about kind of how retreads have a little bit of that tougher shelf life, and they don't necessarily have the ceiling that you always think that they will. But who knows? Maybe for Jimbo Fisher and getting to a new conference like this and being able to kind of step back and realize, all right, I need to put my offense in the faith of somebody else. Maybe that could be the best thing for him and could be the best thing for West Virginia.
Absolutely. All right, SEC title game this weekend, Texas and Georgia. They met before. Georgia really worked Texas in that first half and kind of put them in a spot where they weren't used to being. These two teams have been through a lot of different things since that time and looked a lot of different ways. Is this one where Texas can kind of get back at them, or did Georgia have their scare last week and maybe wake up a little bit?
I think Georgia's going to win the game, but I don't think it'll feel quite like it did last time that these two teams played, just because it's the single most impressive performance by any unit in college football this year. I mean, think about this. Georgia had one scoring drive of at least 35 yards in that football game and won it that convincingly. Now, it was an 89-yard drive after Texas made it a one-score game. The fans were throwing trash on the field, and Georgia sort of, was able to kind of, have that key drive to pull away late. And that was the key moment in that game. Of course, I'm not dismissing that, but I just think that Sark is so good at these adjustments, and they're going to have different protection plans for Quinn Ewers, knowing the limitations with his ankle. And who knows, maybe they're bringing in Arch by design and not necessarily by this default of Quinn Ewers is struggling, we need to just give him a series off. I think that there's something to be said for that. Sark is going to make tremendous adjustments, but I just trust Kirby Smart. I don't know that last week was a scare that they needed before this game, but I do think that this team with Carson Beck playing turnover-free football in the midst of a stretch of 118 consecutive passes without interception, longest of his career, is going to be the key in this game. You cannot let Texas feast on turnovers. They're coming off of a game against A&M in which their defense pitched a shutout. Only score that A&M had was the pick six of Ewers in that one. So, yeah, I think Georgia's able to find a way late, and I think it's the poise of Carson Beck that wins out.
Yeah, the A&M game, and the thing is A&M had opportunities, and Texas just snuffed them out at every chance. I think Colin Klein could have made a couple more innovative play calls, but even if he does, I'm not sure how much different the game is. Like, it might have been 17-13 as opposed to 17-7.
Yeah, I agree. And Texas, I mean, that defense, like, I know we just talked about Georgia having the single most impressive performance by a unit all year. Texas defense, what they did at Kyle Field, I mean, that's got to be up there. Even the Ethan Burke stop on the goal line late in that game. I mean, goodness gracious. I feel like people just keep discounting what this Texas defense is doing, and it's so impressive. I mean, think about this. Like, and I threw this stat out on Twitter earlier in the week. Their two worst defensive games in terms of passing yards allowed were against Kentucky and Michigan, only two teams that had more than 200 passing yards against Texas. Both their quarterbacks got benched mid-game for performance. I mean, that's how good they've been. I mean, they have a 4-18 TD-INT ratio this year. They're allowing 3.99 yards per play. This unit is lights out. They have dudes at every level. How they've been able to replace Sweat and Murphy, gosh, it's one of the most impressive things all year. Pete Kwiatkowski, who I continue to mispronounce his last name. Sorry to PK. But, man, that guy, if he's not one of the finalists for the Broyles Award, I don't know who is, because that Texas defense just continues to show up week after week. I expect them to show up on Saturday, but I do think that it's going to come down to just a couple of those plays, and I think that Georgia's going to make them when it counts.
Connor O'Gara, Saturday Down South. Connor, we'll talk to you soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, man.